everyone, it's Sevi. In this video, we're going to be reviewing the brand new green sword Light of Foliar Incision. Maybe you're here because you're thinking if this is worth pulling in general. Maybe you were aiming for the Jade Spear, but then this showed up instead. Maybe you pulled it out of nowhere but have no Alhaitham and are just wondering who to use it on. Well, whatever the reason, I'm here to help you understand it better. We'll discuss what this sword has to offer and how to decide which characters can best utilize its power. Since it's got a pretty long name, I'm going to simplify it by just calling it LoFi. So with that, let's get started. First of all, we'll take a look at its stats and effect at max level and R1. We can see that it has a base attack stat of 542, which is lower than most other 5-star swords usually offer. However, its substat gives a whopping 88.2% crit damage, which is the highest crit damage sword we have so far. In a way, it's similar to the Jade Cutter, which has the same base attack, but also a huge 44.1% crit rate, which when converted to crit value is exactly the same as the LoFi. That huge crit damage is definitely what makes it a very tempting pull. By virtue of that, we can already treat the weapon as quite a nice stat stick, meaning that it just basically beefs up your character's stat. But that doesn't automatically mean it's better than other 5-star swords even if they have lower crit value, because other factors like its base attack and passive effect are still important considerations. So up next is the LoFi's effects. First, it actually adds a bit more crit rate, 4% at R1 to be exact, which is a small but still welcome bonus that helps you ever so slightly achieve your ideal target crit rate. But the more important effect has to do with its EM related buff. When your normal attacks deal elemental damage, you get the Foliar Incision effect. This is very important because it already indicates that characters who have no innate means of elemental infusion or don't normally take advantage of another character's infusion effect won't be able to fully utilize this weapon. The Foliar Incision effect then adds damage to your normal attack and elemental skill damage, equivalent to 120% of your EM at R1. This damage bonus is like Shenhe's or Yunjin's damage buffs, where it's added to the base damage of a unit's attack. So for example, if your character has 500 EM, 120% of that is 600, and so 600 base damage will be added. And that added damage still gets multiplied by relevant damage bonuses and crit damage. However, this damage buff has a limit. It can only buff 28 instances, combined from both normal attack and skill hits, or the effect expires after 12 seconds. Then you can refresh it after 12 seconds by again doing an elemental damage normal attack. Some other minor attributes I've discovered are that 1. The weapon emits a green glow if the effect is active. 2. This effect can still be active even if the character is swapped out. And 3. If an EM buff is added to the equipped character, like from Nahida's burst, that will be counted towards the weapon's damage buff calculation. All in all, we can see from its effect that it's preferably equipped on characters who can trigger its condition through innate or convenient means, who benefit from building EM, and who deal the majority of their damage through their normal attacks and or skill. Otherwise, if the character can't take advantage of its effect, then at the very least, this weapon will just serve as a huge stat stick for building crit stats. With that in mind, let's discuss how it fares on our current roster of sword users. Let's start with the character it's made for. If you're familiar with Alhaitham's kit, then it's no surprise why this is his clear best in slot weapon. He infuses his basic attacks with Dendro when he has a mirror active, and the majority of Alhaitham's damage does come from his projection attacks, which are considered skill damage, and normal attacks from his combos, so he easily procs the effect and uses up all its instances. A lot of his damage comes from spread reactions too. Spread damage scaling is based on EM and is still affected by crit damage, so he really doesn't mind the weapon's lower than usual base attack since attack stats are a lower priority on him anyway. The insanely high crit damage has a bigger benefit for him. And EM is very valuable for him since aside from it affecting spread damage, it's actually part of what his skill and burst talent multipliers scale from. His A4 passive also converts EM into damage bonuses for his skill and burst. An average Alhaitham build will see a high EM stat on him, something like 400 to 600 probably, which can go higher with teammate buffs, so the weapon's damage buff will definitely be maximized. In fact, if you're actually wondering if it's more worth it to go for Alhaitham's early constellations or his signature weapon, LoFi in general can give a 20 to 25% DPS increase if you're coming from a free-to-play weapon like Tokabo Shigure or Iron Sting. On the other hand, Alhaitham C2 gives a 10 to 15% increase from C0. If you reach up to C3, that gives a 16 to 21% increase from C0. I have more info on Alhaitham's constellations in my previous cons guide on him, so you can check that out later if you're interested. So this is actually one of the uncommon cases where if you were debating between pulling a 5-star C2 or C3 versus their signature weapon, just for the DPS increase you would gain on that character, I would recommend the weapon more if you have the primos to spare. To sum it up, Alhaitham's signature weapon synergizes incredibly well with him. But what about other characters? Who else is LoFi good on, and who can use its stats and passive as effectively as possible? Let's discuss that. I'll first list down who the LoFi isn't really as good on. By that, I mean characters who won't really be able to activate its passive or maximize its potential. That doesn't mean it's completely unusable on them. After all, it is a crit stat stick at the very least and a possible upgrade over 4-star options. However, being usable doesn't mean unlocking its full potential. It's also up against tough competition with other 5-star swords like the Jade Cutter, which is a very universal weapon that gives additional attack with no conditions required. Or the Mist Splitter, which gives a universal elemental damage bonus rather than only specifically buffing skill or normal attack hits. The first criteria should be, can the character naturally proc the LoFi's effect by doing an elemental normal attack? There are technically characters that can give infusions like Chongyun, Candace, or C6 Bennett, but forcing them to team up with someone they don't really synergize with just to proc the effect can be counterintuitive, gimmicky, or just plain worse. And if characters can proc the effect, the next criteria should be if they benefit from EM or use their normal attacks and skill as primary damage sources. So which units will fall in these criteria? Albedo, Layla, Chi-Chi, Xingqiu, Jean, Kuki Shinobu, Nilou, and Traveler all come to mind as characters who won't proc the effect. And for some of them, they don't even want to build EM, or their main damage sources aren't their normal attacks or skill. You might consider Ayaka, who innately does cryo-infused normal attacks, but with her freeze teams, there's no reason to build EM on her, and even if there's probably a melt team you can make a niche case for, her primary damage source is still her burst anyway. If you do want to use this as a crit stat stick on Ayaka, take note that in a freeze team, she already builds a lot of crit damage from her artifacts and her ascension stat. Stacking too much will cause diminishing returns, and there can be opportunities where having more attack is better for her damage. Then, Kaya builds some EM on a melt playstyle, and you can technically pair him with Chongyun or C6 Bennett to infuse his attacks in such teams. Kaya has decent normal attacks, but his best melt team uses him as a burst quick swap unit, and LoFi does not buff burst damage. Alright, so next up are the characters who actually have more synergy with the LoFi compared to the previous units. It doesn't necessarily mean that the LoFi is now the unit's best in slot, as there are still other 5-star weapons that can have better synergy with them. But these are the ones who can make better use of what the LoFi has to offer, whether in general or with a specific build/playstyle in mind. One pretty good user is Keqing with an Aggravate build who does want to build some EM to buff her reaction damage. But since the LoFi buffs normal and skill damage, you'll want to give Keqing a longer on-field time where she can do more normal attacks to maximize the weapon's effect. Having Thundering Fury is also a plus, so she can use her skill more often, which the LoFi also buffs. Normally, Keqing's attack strings involve her doing charged attack spams, but her N4C is a good second place in terms of damage that doesn't cost as much stamina and lets you do more normal attacks. So in general, the LoFi will likely be an above average weapon in her weapon rankings. However, it has a lot of 5-star competition. Keqing already has prominent alternatives like the Jade Cutter, Mist Splitter, or Haran, and those can arguably have more universal utility if you want to switch them around. Next, Ayato is able to proc the effect since his Hydro Slashes are considered normal attack damage, but he's not someone you generally want to build EM on, which might make the effect pointless on him. However, there are some team scenarios where he can have a teammate that gives an EM buff, like an instructor set equipped Bennett, a Sucrose, or a Nahida in a Bloom-based team. In those cases, he gets some EM for the weapon's effect to scale from, making it at least have more utility than being a crit stat stick. Then for a niche user, a Vaporize or Melt Bennett is actually a good choice. In this playstyle, C6 Bennett, Chongyun, or even Candace are required for the normal attack infusion to proc. And since he's buffing his own attack with his burst, this compensates for the LoFi's low base attack. If paired with good hydro or cryo application, Bennett can reliably trigger vaporize or melt reactions on his skill and some on his infused auto attacks, and he does want to build some EM in that playstyle. I actually made a guide some time ago about this DPS Bennett build, and if you're curious how it works, you can check it out later with the link in the description. Lastly, if you're a whale and simp who has a C6 Kazuha, he could make really good use of the LoFi. C6 gives him the ability to do Animo Infusion on his auto attacks, on top of giving them additional damage that scales with his EM. So now he gets a convenient way of triggering the weapon's effect, and since he builds EM, that synergizes perfectly with the weapon's EM-based buff too. So after evaluating how the LoFi synergizes with all these sword users, what can we take from this? Well, as we can see, it has a particular EM-based passive effect that only a select few sword users can make good use of or trigger in the first place. The way it perfectly synergizes specifically with Alhaitham is a pretty noticeable gap compared to other potential users. And so my general recommendation is that if you want the best for Alhaitham and are looking for a big boost from his 4-star options, this weapon will be a really good pull, and it's transferable to other characters as a crit stat stick at least. However, if you already have a crit 5-star sword, there's little incentive to pull this whether for Alhaitham or another character. And if you're considering pulling just to generally have a 5-star sword, I think it's a better idea to wait for another weapon banner that has either a more universal passive sword or the specific best in slot for the character you're aiming for. Still, I do think there's potential for new sword users down the line for this weapon to have high synergy with, particularly those who will have elemental infusion built into their playstyle and an incentive to build a lot of EM just like Alhaitham. We'll have to wait and see. And that's it for this guide. I'm curious if you pulled for the LoFi or if you were still on the fence about it when you clicked this video. Let me know in the comments. Anyway, if this video helped you out, don't forget to leave a like, consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all soon. Take care!